Okay, so this is chapter 17 of the Inward Markings Garment Company vlog. If you go to inwardmarkings.com, you'll see the YouTube link there where you can watch the other 16 chapters of this vlog, which you'll need to do to make sense of today. I'm going to be showing you the synchronicities of the first half of 2018, just after my arrival back in Melbourne. So what you've seen so far are synchronicities that have occurred gradually, 90% of them anyway. Fuck it, I'm not going to talk about all of them, that have occurred gradually over an extended period of time, like a couple of decades, and then things just started to intensify in this much smaller time frame of about 22 months. And so, along with the catalyst that I talked about in the last vlog regarding the TV series Girls and other things, these synchronicities happened around that, alongside those catalysts, if you like. And so just bear in mind, this is the first half of 2018, and then in future episodes I will talk about the further intensification that occurred from mid 2018 to the current period, to the current time. So here you go. Okay, so right behind me on that side street there is where I turned the corner in the first half of 2018. I think it might have been like my first or second synchronicity. Walked up that street, and a long-time legendary graffiti artist named Dash, who's also grew up in Perth, Western Australia, was walking down the street, and we crossed paths exactly. And I'd actually worked with Dash on a few projects 15 or so years prior, and that was actually the third synchronistic or serendipitous occurrence that I had with Dash. He's part of the 21st Century Crew, a legendary crew of graffiti artists, and you'll see the first two in a moment. See ya. Okay, so this tram stop here is where I had my first synchronicity with Dash. He got on the tram that I was on, and there'd been a history to that because I'd heard about Dash through people that I'd spent time with just in the period immediately prior to that. So this was around 1999, so a really long time ago. But in the year or so before that, I'd heard a lot about Dash and was really interested in his work. That was probably like a peak point of his career, for want of a better term. And interestingly, just behind there is where I had the synchronicity with the comedian Greg Fleet. So that was the first one. And I know I wasn't going to talk about the ones that I didn't mention regarding the sort of gradual progression of synchronicities that occurred throughout my life, but this one feels relevant. And so, yeah, like I said, graffiti's been a big part of my life, and mostly as someone who just loves the culture and the art. So this was then to become more significant, not just in terms of the period leading up to the launch of Inward Markings, but my work in harm reduction and community development. Okay. So right behind me about there, around 2004, is when Dash pulled up in his car and I arrived at the intersection on foot at exactly the same time. And it was perfect alignment because I looked to my right exactly as he pulled up, and he was in the driver's seat, so we were basically facing each other on opposite sides of the road. I walked over to him and introduced myself. He didn't remember me from the first meeting, and I think that was the most significant synchronous meeting with Dash, because we ended up working on some projects together where he was able to do his amazing graffiti. If you haven't seen Dash's work, there's one on the inside of a building in terms of what we did called Healthworks in Footscray in the inner west of Melbourne. But his pieces, public pieces, are around all over the place, I imagine, most certainly in Perth. And so projects like that and its relation to the overall context of street art and street culture were on my mind at the time of that third meeting after I arrived in Melbourne. Okay, so right behind me on the corner back there, I crossed paths with a long-time Melbourne-based graffiti artist who writes Knack. I'd worked with Knack like a long time ago in harm reduction, over 15 years ago, and had been thinking about him in the period leading up to that encounter, which was at like 3 in the morning, something like that. And again, there was no one else around. It was really weird, and we just crossed paths at that exact moment. I've never seen Knack before or since, but I was thinking about him because I'd revisited some work that he'd done on some walls here in the inner north, and was hoping to run into him again. And that would be part of a greater like synchronicity, or a greater bunch of synchronicities regarding graffiti. And graffiti has been a part of my life forever, pretty much. So there's that. Okay, so behind me right there is where I had a synchronicity with a skater named Nick Corbett, I think it is. Surname's definitely Corbett. But I'd seen him in a skate video, I think it's called Objects, like a few weeks prior, but it was one particular trick of his that I was impressed by. It was like this, I think a flip back tail or just a back tail on this like shop front step. I think it's in an outer suburb somewhere, and made a point of sharing that with friends on Facebook, just that one particular trick. And several weeks later, I'm just walking past this spot, which is like a basketball court, and is kind of fairly widely known, but I hardly ever walk this way, and there he was, and I've never seen him ever again or since in the whole area. And this location was to play out further with other skateboarders. And so yeah, skateboarding, graffiti, those aspects of street culture have always been really important to me. But when I came back to Melbourne and was in that kind of ecstatic state, it really was particularly resonant, because it seemed like both skateboarding and graffiti had become bigger than I'd ever seen them be in this part of the city. Okay. And so it was on this hill, I guess you could call it like a grassy knoll type thing, that I first saw pro skater Morgan Campbell. And he skates for the Four Skate Company, and I saw him after first becoming his friends on Facebook and interacting with him on social media while in Bangkok, so about 5 years previous, and had not seen him in person in that whole time, and then just happened to cross paths with him while I was walking down on that path there, and he was up here on this hill. And that would be one of 3 serendipitous meetings that I would have with Morgan Campbell, and the other 2 actually occurred post mid-2018, so I'll talk about them later, because that was a different period again. So there's that. Okay, so at a coffee shop just behind me on the corner there, that's where I was walking up this street, and I hit the corner and immediately saw the Yorta Yorta hip-hop artist Briggs, or Senator Briggs. He's not really a senator, but I don't give a fuck. I think he'll do as equally as good a job as any fucking senator who sits on their ass in Parliament today. I just said hello to him as I crossed the road and passed the entrance, but felt compelled to go back and just chat with him, because I'd been following him on social media for a number of years before that, and had really had really been affected by his track Bad Apples, and he then went on to form Bad Apples Music, which you should definitely check out. And I was able to actually convey that to him verbally, so it wasn't just a kind of random happening. I encountered him at a particular time, and this was really quite soon after arriving back in Melbourne. And yeah, so it was timely to be able to convey that to him because of the way I'd been affected by his music in the period leading up to that. So there's that. Okay, so behind me there is, I guess you could say, yeah, it's an iconic skate spot in Melbourne called the Fitzroy Bowl. It's in Edinburgh Gardens in Fitzroy North, and that's where I crossed paths with Dave Quirk, who is a comedian, but he's also a skater. And it was a weird time because it was kind of, I think, mid-afternoon, and like other encounters, there was just no one around, and I just happened to be walking to the bowl at the exact same time that he was walking to the bowl, and he was just standing there, and I caught up to him in like 30 or so seconds. It was just a weird like serendipity because it was just so quiet with no one around, just like with the Geoffrey Rush one and others. And I'd sort of had brief contact with Dave Quirk in the period leading up to my return to Melbourne via social media. He did a podcast that I was listening to, but I actually first met Dave Quirk like a decade and a half ago. I was buying a skateboard for the nephew of my partner at the time, and he was working at a skate shop in Fitzroy. And then I saw him again later when I was filming this little video interview, because he was working at this other skate shop where this person I was interviewing was working. So there was this lead up, but of particular relevance to seeing Dave Quirk just after I arrived in the first half of 2018 is that I'd had some contact with him via social media in the period beforehand. So again, the timing is not merely random. So there's that. And so again, in that first half of 2018, I was walking to the library, and Marty Brown, who's a drummer, he was in a band called The Art of Fighting, but I affectionately call him Mr. Bowditch because his partner is Claire Bowditch, the musician, and I'm sure he hates it, but it's just something I've consistently done. And he was crossing about there at the exact same time to walk his dog, I think. And that would be one of 4 serendipitous occurrences with him. And I think the first 3 were in the first half of 2018, and then 5. Is it 5? It's 4 or 5. Anyway, I will talk about the others when I'm in those locations. But yeah, there's that. So right behind me there is an intersection of Fitzroy again, where I had my second serendipitous encounter with Marty Brown, Mr. Bowditch. Now, it didn't just happen at any time like the first encounter that I talked about. Leading up to that time, I'd been on a mailing list for Claire Bowditch for a long time, and found out during that time when I was in Bangkok, when I was on the mailing list, that about what she was doing with like empowering women regarding business and things like that, but also that she did the same degree as me at which is no longer around, but it was a special degree called a Bachelor of Creative Arts. It was like this joint initiative between the Victorian College of the Arts and the University of Melbourne, and it was such a cherished degree, and the people who went to it, amazing people. It was just something about it, and like the lecturers, the course, all of that. And so students actually protested after it was discontinued, it was that special. Anyway, other people who went there are the filmmaker Genevieve Bailey, yeah, it was an amazing place to be. So yeah, that was the second one. Okay, and so right behind me there is a supermarket in the Fitzroy North area where I first encountered the comedian Rod Contock. And this was just after listening to his podcast with the comedian Will Anderson. And then there would be two further encounters. Okay, so after I arrived back in Melbourne, and that initial massive change occurred in my life, I just found myself compelled to go certain places, and this was a place that I just felt compelled to come to like every night, kind of after dinner. And it was especially beautiful on the full moon, which would often shine kind of above there. And I just had to come here every night, and it was just a place to be present and to be around the flowing water and the sound of the flowing water. And it just became a very special evening ritual. And then one evening I'd been listening to the Willosophy podcast, which is by a comedian, Will Anderson, who I've mentioned in a previous episode, in which he chats with Rod Contock, who is also an Australian comedian, and he's a long-time performer. And and then that evening I was pondering the content. It's a great episode. And then went on my way home, and I'll tell you what happened next. So that evening, after I was down at that beautiful spot along the Merry Creek, I then went to a store just diagonally across the intersection there, and was thinking about the Rod Contock philosophy all the while walking up. It's about a 15-minute walk, and just felt compelled to get something sweet. And as soon as I walked into the delicatessen type store, Rod Contock was literally standing in the queue buying 2 tubs of ice cream. And so I was able to share the thoughts that I'd had walking on the way up. And so yeah, that was second to the community supermarket encounter that I had with him. But I hadn't really processed stuff, or maybe I just knew of the podcast at that first occasion and didn't have anything to share. But by this time, I can't remember how much longer afterwards, maybe it was a couple of weeks, I'd listened to the podcast and was able to have that discussion. So yeah, there's that. So there's one more encounter with Rod Contock, but that's significant to the far more intensive period in the second half of 2018. Okay, so back there on that corner in the first half of 2018, I crossed paths at the exact time when I turned the corner with a comedian called Tommy Dasilo. He does a podcast called The Little Dum Dum Club, and I'd been listening to that in Bangkok in the period leading up to my return to Australia. But I didn't say anything because he was immersed in his phone as he was walking. So there's that. Okay, so back just there in that section of road near the tram stop, I crossed paths with the comedian Tommy Little. It was like really it was about, I think, 8:30, 9 a.m. in the morning. And I often walk on roads where I can because I just can't stand what gets... Sometimes it feels like I'm fucking in a minefield walking on the footpath. Anyway, and I can't remember why he said... I'm pretty sure I was like on the other side of the road, and he was on the other side of the road also walking along the road. And I hadn't seen Tommy Little before. I knew what he looked like, but I'd read an article about him doing some interesting and I thought commendable work nursing homes or old aged homes. And so I'm pretty sure I tweeted him. So there was that relevance in the immediate period prior to having that encounter. But also, it was at the time when there was like this accusation of sexual abuse, I guess, regarding the comedian Tom Ballard, and I was able to. I just felt compelled to share that with Tom Little, and he was saying that he'd just been he'd known Tom Ballard for a long time, etc. So it was actually a good opportunity, or it became a fortuitous opportunity regarding that. Okay, there's that. So just at that T intersection there is where I crossed paths again with Tommy Little. We literally walked into that T intersection from different directions at the exact same time. It was around that same early morning period. But it's just like one of these clusters that occurs that I've talked about. Oh, I talked about it in an Instagram story, but it's just there'll be an intensive period where I will have these encounters with particular people for a period of time, and then I will not see them again for either a really long time or possibly ever. Like with Tommy Little, I've never seen him at that time in the morning in this area at any time ever again. So yeah, who knows? But yeah, these clusters happen. Okay, so right at that intersection there, which is in the middle of this wide two-way parade, if you like, is where I crossed at the exact moment that Red Symons entered that little gap there as well. Red Symons he was a musician with the band called the Skyhooks from the 70s, and he went on to do media stuff and had a ABC radio show. And this was really early in the morning, and like other encounters I've had, it was weird because there was hardly anyone around, because even at that time in the morning there's usually a bit more traffic. But anyway, what was interesting about that is that it was around the time it was during the time when ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC here in Australia, was having challenges regarding its funding, leadership, etc. And Red Symons was someone who I just followed a little bit during my time in Bangkok in terms of his radio show. And there was can't remember exactly now, but there was an issue around his show, and he ended up discontinuing that role. And I don't think he's returned to ABC Radio since. And I was able to have a discussion with him about that stuff. So again, the timing was significant. And then interestingly, I cooked dinner for a few of my mum's friends, I think about 10 or so days later, and a couple of them knew Red Symons. And then Red Symons appeared in the media a little time after that because of something tragic related to his son's passing. So yeah, there's that. Okay, so right around the corner there is where there was a cafe, and I walked past there at the same time as the ABC journalist Patricia Karvelas, who is relevant in two ways. So at the time that I encountered her, there was a lot of discussion in the media around the defunding or funding cuts from the ABC, as well as leadership issues. But also Patricia Karvelas had been a point of discussion of my brothers regarding just past political activism, etc. But yeah, like with Red Symons, it occurred in a timely manner. And I've never seen Patricia Karvelas in this entire area at any time ever again. Okay, so again, in the first half of 2018, I was walking along in the middle of the day. It was really quite busy, and I crossed paths at the exact moment, just in this throng of people, just happened to be in the direct line that the Australian comedian Matt Okine was walking, and it was about there somewhere, and I'd been following Matt Okine for a little while, but he followed me back on social media kind of in the period leading up to that, and so again the timing was relevant. So there's that. So right about here is where I turned the corner and ran into a man named Dr. David Jacka, who I'd worked alongside, not directly, but in the same field when I was working in harm reduction in Melbourne before I left for Sydney and then Southeast Asia. And the thing about Dr. Jacka is he was one of the people I was thinking about when I was in Bangkok, especially in terms of I knew that the work that he and other people had done in the region had laid the foundations for the services that I was benefiting from when I was there. So it was very timely to run into him just after I'd arrived back in Melbourne, and I was able to convey that to him. I also curiously saw the footballer Shane Crawford, or ex-footballer Shane Crawford, doing some filming out the front of the place on the corner there. But I don't think that has any relevance to what I'm doing. So anyway, there's that. Okay, so right behind me is where I had my second serendipitous encounter with the comedian Will Anderson. Talked about the first one in the previous episode. And this was again in the first half of 2018. And the timing was good again, I guess, in that I'd sent a self-addressed envelope to get a ticket autographed by him to his management people, and I think about like 6 or 8 weeks later it arrived. And so pretty much a couple of days, it was definitely during the same week that it arrived in my mailbox. I was walking along this back street of Fitzroy, and this car had parked here, but I only saw the passenger getting out, and the passenger was getting out with a pot plant. And this sounds weird, creepy, whatever. I just felt compelled to just mention to people carrying plants that I think it's cool that people cherish plants and nature, because it was just something that, like, life was just incredible and new after my arrival back in Melbourne for reasons I've talked about in previous chapters. And it just felt important to just share with people the importance of nature and cherishing plants, etc. And so that's the reason why I approached the woman getting out of the car. But I think she, like, who turned out to be Will Anderson's partner, I think she, like, must have gone around the back or something. So I was like, just going to mention it to the person getting out of the driver's side. And literally, I only realised it was Will Anderson when he emerged from the car, opened the door and emerged. I had no idea about the car or who was in it. And then proceeded to shake his hand and chat with him. But it was only at that very last second that I realised. So there's that. Okay, so again in the first half of 2018, I had 2 serendipitous encounters just around that street, part of the street there, Smith Street in Collingwood. I crossed the road at the exact kind of point where a skateboarder, photographer, filmer named Moe, his first name's Jason, I don't know what his surname is, happened to be standing on the other side of the road. It was in the mid-afternoon or something, and he was actually holding a Zero skateboards deck as well. So it was relevant because Moe is someone that I'd followed during my time in Southeast Asia, because I'd appreciated the work that he'd done. He'd been doing a heap of photography work for this particular period during that time. Haven't seen him around so much lately in terms of that stuff. I saw him in Port Melbourne a few months ago. And I also was on a tram when I went past... the Zero board is relevant because while I was in Southeast Asia, the distribution company that Jamie Thomas, the founder of Zero, had set up, called Black Box Distribution, had closed down, and that was a huge shock to me because I'd just seen that company grow so so significantly over a period of time, and he won an award and all that. Anyway, and I was on a tram again in the first half of 2018, and I went past while Plutonic Lab and his partner Nicole, who's this amazing photographer, were just standing chatting to someone. And again, of relevance because Plutonic Lab is someone who I think his real name is Lee, but I actually had a serendipitous encounter with him like 15 or so years ago at a store that's now closed called This Is It, which is founded and run by this amazing graffiti artist called Jaws. Dom, I think is his real name, and just happened to walk in the store at the same time that he was there. And so yeah, again, but also I'd been following him on social media. He's the drummer for the live drummer for the Hilltop Hoods, and I'd been really I'd been listening to the Hilltop Hoods when I first ran into him all that time, because their album The Calling had come out, but while in Southeast Asia, Walking Under Stars and holy fuck, its partner album were released, and they were incredible. They had a massive influence on me, and now The Great Expanse is amazing as well. So there's that. Okay, thanks for watching. Next installment obviously is chapter 18. Just bear in mind that these synchronicities in the catalyst all occurred after my arrival in Melbourne, when that immense change occurred within me. And from mid-2018 onward, things started to get hectic, and I will talk about that next. Okay, see ya.